Iowa, Mr. King, the chairman of the Subcommittee on the Constitution and Civil Justice, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate being recognized, and I appreciate Mr. Sensenbrenner and you and others working to bring the Kelo decision forward. I wanted to recap some of my memories with regard to the Kelo decision. And when that decision came down, it was shocking to us who read the Constitution. Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. Very, very clear. Our founding fathers had great reverence for property, life, liberty, and property, and yet the effect of that decision was, as Chairman Goodlatte said, to strike 3 words from the Fifth Amendment for public use. And I was livid at that decision of the Supreme Court. I couldn't think it could be more starkly wrong. When the court comes down with a decision that doesn't match up to what the Constitution says, then we look at that and we think, well, how are we going to amend the Constitution to fix this one? And the only words we could come up with were, and we really mean it this time, put those 3 words back in. Of course, we know that's not any more effective than the original words that were there. So we brought a resolution within 7 days. We brought a resolution of disapproval to the floor of the House of Representatives, and in that, and I had not yet read Justice O'Connor's dissent. But when I went to the floor, I found out that later on that my words matched hers. And I was sitting in the front row waiting for the former member of this committee, Barney Frank, to finish his statements, planning on rebutting Mr. Frank. What I found out was he agreed with me. It all flowed out the same way, that for public use is an important clause within the Fifth Amendment, and it needs to be restored within the Fifth Amendment. So Justice O'Connor, Barney Frank, Steve King, and a whole list of others agreed that the Fifth Amendment means what it says. I brought also an amendment to the appropriations bill to strike, as my memory tells me, $1.5 million from the administrative budget of the Supreme Court, which was the nominal amount of the property that was confiscated in New London. And of course, that was amazingly didn't pass off the floor of the House at that time. But it sent a message to the court, and the court was completely out of bounds. I hosted a breakfast with Justice Scalia some months after that, and this is the part that I wanted to make sure goes into the record. He said he expected the erroneous, that's my word, erroneous, I'll just put it this way. He expected the Kelo decision at some point to be reversed by the court. I look forward to that day, and we're doing what we can do this day to restore as many property rights as we can legislatively. So I applaud the authors of this legislation, urge its adoption, yield back the balance of my time.